Hi. So you want me to talk about Middle English literature? Well, yes, I shall. But please don't expect a very pious scholarly lecture from me. I simply can't give such a lecture. Okay, so we are talking about Middle English literature. Who wrote what we call Middle English literature? Yes, it was written in Britain, in England to be precise, during the medieval period, which uh, conventional historians note was from 1100 to 1500 BC, CE, I mean. Who were the people who wrote this literature? Yes, Anglo-Saxons primarily, yes, but Anglo-Saxons who had been Normanized after the Norman invasion, in fact, that was in 1066. So, who were these Normans? Not certainly total strangers to the Anglo Saxons, who had peopled England in the 5th century CE. The Normans were actually cousins, a little removed perhaps, but certainly Germanic in origin, cousins of the Anglo Saxons, a Scandinavian people who had settled in what was then called the Normandy province of France and adopted the French language. So this language, which we call Norman French, was not the same as Parisian French, the French of Louis XIV, the French which at one time became the lingua franca of Europe. That was much later. So the Parisian French was not the same as Norman French. These two territories were entirely different. So the French that the conquerors uh, brought to England was Norman French. So by the beginning of the 12th century, a little after the conquest, a certain kind of aristocracy consisting primarily of Norman aristocrats, people who were given rights over land, developed. So, but this was followed by the Normanization of the earlier Anglo-Saxon elite aristocracy. So, by the 13th century, you have an Anglo-Norman aristocracy, a blend of Norman and Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. So, there you are. So we are talking about Old English literature, which began to be written by the 12th century, early 12th century. So unlike what we normally would think about such a situation, the old Anglo-Saxon uh, literary style or literary modes did not go completely out of fashion. They survived. They survived in mostly in areas which were not directly under Norman influence. So, and even otherwise, this mode of writing, because there is a continuity you can see between the Old English period and the Middle English period. Both periods. I mean, especially towards the end of the Old English period, England is almost a completely Christian country. The country being converted, entire country being converted to Christianity, the conversion which started in 6th century. So there is certainly a continuity. The church just continued to be as powerful as it was during the uh, Old English period. So in the Middle English period, at the beginning of the Middle English period, you have what is called a continuity of Anglo-Saxon literature, Old English literature, which you can see in a work like Brut, Lyman's, the poet was called Lyman's Brut, which is actually an epic which follows the Anglo-Saxon tradition. You also have a collection of homilies or sermons called Omulum, published at the same time. almost at the same time. So the English court continued to use French, Norman French, till 1386, when it reverted to English as the official language or the court language, the language to be used in the court. So you have two kinds of literature, especially in poetry. One is the kind of narrative literature, which is a continuation of the Old English literature, as exemplified by Brut. The other is a kind of didactic literature, especially Christian, not especially, completely Christian in content. Okay, sermons, homilies. So, apart from this, by the beginning of the 13th century, you have a distinctly continental kind of, by continental, I mean the kind of poetry, the kind of literature which prevailed in the continent, especially in France, okay, both in Normandy and elsewhere. So this kind of poetry gets popular in Britain, and so one of the most important modes of this poetry was what is called the verse romance. Okay, the term meaning not exactly what it means now, but indicating a literary text, whether uh, poetry or prose, with themes like adventures, wars, love, all these, a mixture of all these. Okay, generally, and its later form was later um, representation. Its later appearance was, as we know, in fiction, mostly in fiction. So I think one can also find an influence from Italy, which especially during the 13th century had a very rich literature. Okay, so having said this, how did how did this literature continue to flourish, or was there some other forms of literature which lay beyond the I mean, confines, beyond the limits of this official or often what we call courtly literature? Yeah, there were. There were a number of ballads, folk poems, few of which have survived. Okay, they were very, very different in content from the what we call the official literature, the official poetry of the time. For instance, you have ballads about highway robbers, ballads about outlaws. Okay, there were a number of ballads about an outlaw called Robin Hood. You've heard of him. Okay, a few of which have survived. Some of which have survived because of the efforts of later writers like Sir Walter Scott in the 18th and the 19th century. So these ballads, and as we look further into the 13th century, we find that many of these folk poems were, very volatile, very revolutionary in content, which attacked the existing feudal ecclesiastical system, written by rebels who formed what were called rebel Christian sects, like the Lowlands. I'll be coming to that soon. All right. So, and at this time, during the 13th and 14th century, we have we look at the appearance of what we today call the lyric. Lyric poetry, many literary historians say, was completely alien to Old English. There are very few poems which could be classified as lyrics. Most of the poems are narrative in form. Okay, lyric is a poem, roughly what we can define as a poem which is short, which uses a few images, especially to convey a particular emotion, a particular impression. Okay, so these are some of the ways in which you can define the lyric. So lyric poetry, it seems, appears largely in the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century in Middle English literature. Okay, definitely an influence from France, and of course, probably Italy. So you have these lyrics which forms in one way part of chivalric literature. Because what is chivalry? How is it connected to romance? So chivalry is a kind of a concept about involving certain values like courage, uh, dignity, respect to women. Okay, a the camaraderie between people in war, knights, all these things together. Okay, what we still use the term chivalrous, but of course not in the way people in medieval England used it. Okay, we still use it to indicate some kind of a gentlemanly behavior, but chivalrous had a clear-cut senses during the Middle Age. All right. Now, okay. So this language in which Old English literature was written had, of course, changed vastly. You can call this period as the foundational period of modern English, in which the influence exerted by Norman French completely changed the texture of the language. Its structural properties underwent drastic change, revision. You had the declension, you had the tendency of less inflections, tendency of inflections to come down drastically, the numbers of inflections to come down drastically, the introduction of new vowels, the introduction of certain grammatic properties which made English more an analytical language than a synthetic language. A synthetic language is one in which a large number of words can be put together as a big compound. German is still a synthetic language, or an agglutinative language, as it is called. Whereas modern English, contemporary English is more of an analytical language in which things like prepositions or conjunctions are separated from the root words. Okay, whereas in certain languages they form what are called inflectional patterns. In languages like Malayalam or Hindi, perhaps. Okay, when you say NA or Enike, to me, in English you have two words, a preposition and the root word to express the same idea. Okay, so this is how the language changed. And the literature also changed with it, as we saw. Anglo-Saxon poetic, especially alliterative poetry, poetry in which in the same line, the same syllable, the same vowel or consonant repeated itself, still existed in Middle English poetry, but its texture was changed by the introduction of romances, by the appearance of ballads, okay, long narrative poems, especially those with folk content and folk appearance, folk promotion, okay, poems which people took to their hearts. Okay, most of them outside the confines of official or courtly poetry. Okay, so now we come to certain some of the important authors. Okay, definitely Chaucer was an important author. Chaucer, who, as you know, wrote Canterbury Tales, as well as some other memorable works like The Parliament of Fowls, Troilus and Cressida, The Tale of the Duchess, and similar, and a number of smaller poems. So Canterbury Tales was certainly the most important work. And Chaucer was a courtly poet, and he later held several positions in government, including that of a customs officer. So whatever his poetic merits, he was, as there is some records to show, was a very corrupt official. Okay, so much for the integrity of poets. Okay, so his contemporary, interestingly, one of his contemporaries was William Langland. And they wrote, interestingly, in two different dialects. Chaucer's dialect was called the East Midland dialect, okay, spoken in the East Midland area and extending up to London. Okay, because London was the center of power, this dialect became virtually the standard form of English. And many other poets like Gower and later Sir Thomas Malory wrote in this dialect. But Langland, who was Chaucer's contemporary, wrote in the West Midland dialect, which did not become the standard. So, but as we now know, both East Midland dialect and West Midland dialect are were not so distant from each other. They had close affinities, but the East Midland dialect seems to us to be more comprehensible because it's closer to modern English, because modern English evolved from East Midland dialect. We know that. So Chaucer's use of the East Midland dialect, his borrowal of the narrative structure of Canterbury Tales, certainly from the 13th century Italian writer Boccaccio, who became famous for his Decameron, which is today available in 2 volumes. His tales of often mischievous tales about the nobility and the uh, clergy of Italy. Okay, and then definitely Chaucer seems to have borrowed, especially in his criticism of some of the members of the clergy that you find in Canterbury Tales. But our critics have often pointed out that his portrayal of the nun, for example, in Canterbury Tales, was not as pungent as many people would like to believe. So the locket which you find around the nun's neck, on which was inscribed the dictum, Amor vincit omnia, love conquers all, did not have the kind of sexual connotations which earlier critics attributed to it. Love simply meant love. Okay, it could be Christian love. Okay, it could be divine love. Okay, although the nun appears a very uh, lavish, appears to lead a very lavish, extraordinary, extravagant life. Probably you can't attribute any kind of sexual depravity on her part, which is would be reading your ideas into Chaucer's. Anyway, but his criticism of the clergy, his criticism of the lower nobility, he was careful not to criticize the uh, higher nobility nor the royalty, because he was naturally he couldn't do that because he was a courtly poet. All right. So, but the other poet of note, Chaucer's contemporary, Langland, was a rebel because his poem, Pierce the Plowman, features a very pious Christian farmer who lived, plowman, who lived according to the best of Christian idols, who was not part of the exploitative class which ruled England at that time. So Langland's poem was paralleled by several uh, songs and poems, few of which have been recovered. Many of these poems and songs were sung during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. So the Peasants' Revolt was uh, an event which shook medieval England. So this happened as an aftermath to the plague which ravaged Europe in the years 1347-48. About one third of the total population of Europe, it's believed, uh, perished in this plague. So the plague left a large number of peasants and serfs dead. So it was very difficult to find labor to work the fields. And the wars of the English king had become costly. So, in spite of the fact that the peasants were unable to pay taxes, he had to levy more taxes, and this naturally caused uh, great aversion among the peasants and serfs, and they revolted. So this revolt, it appears, was masterminded, led, prompted by a number of rebel Christians, those who became organized under the name of Lollards. And the organization of Lollards as a rebel sect was certainly the result of the preaching of John Wycliffe, the first translator of the Bible into English. It is an unfinished translation. We don't have the complete translation, or probably it is not completely translated. Only a few fragments have survived. But Wycliffe was influential. And you have poets like John Ball, okay, along with leaders like Wat Tytler, who led the revolt. So Ball's poem has survived. And the two lines which we often quote today are, when Adam delved and Eve spun, who was then the gentleman? So looking back to primeval times in the Garden of Eden, where you had Adam and Eve, who the all Semitic religions posit as the parents of all humanity. So when Adam and Eve lived in paradise, in Garden of Eden, there were no lords or serfs. Okay. So this Christian egalitarian idea was espoused and propagated to arouse the peasants to revolt. So actually, John Ball's poem was in Middle English. This is a translation. What I just read out is a translation. So there were a number of poems and songs, few of which have survived. And interestingly, certain nursery rhymes, which are still used, are believed to have originated during the medieval period. For instance, you have this poem, Ringa, ringa roses, a pocket full of posies, achoo, achoo, all fall down. So this nursery rhyme is supposed to refer to the plague of 1347-48. And another well-known nursery rhyme, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after, is also attributed, its origin is also attributed to the medieval period. And certain critics have pointed out that there might be a sexual overtone to the poem. Okay, so these are just a few that one can extract or one can find from the large volume of poetry which was written during the medieval period, many of which were simply existed in oral form. Okay, now, I've already mentioned ballads. And along with these ballads, there's a tradition of legends, many of which centered around a hero called Arthur. So Arthur is, according to some anthropologists, historians, literary investigators, actually a Celtic hero who first came down to the Anglo-Saxon, then to the Normans. Okay, in various forms. All the legends, a continuing cycle of legends that you have. Okay, and in Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, it's a prose narrative, published much later in 1486 and printed by Caxton, we find the legend retold. So prose works were, as we know, not very numerous during this period. Poetry was the primary legend. So one other work, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, 14th century. John Gower's Confessio Amandus, 1386. Gower was a contemporary of Chaucer. And then we have a number of court poets, other court poets. One was Lydgate, who wrote the Book of Troy, Life of Lords, and similar small works. Certainly, so for want of more powerful writers, Lydgate is often considered one of the important prose writers of the period. So these writers about what was happening in English drama. Was there English drama during this period? Well, if you are thinking about drama which is written, if you are thinking about scripts which have survived, there are very few. Probably some scribbled notes exist, but performance was quite common. Okay, and Elizabethan drama primarily evolved out of medieval dramatic forms. Most of it was basically religious. So one kind of play was called the mystery play, which featured tales, incidents from the Bible, narrated even the life of saints, incident from the Bible, incident from the life of Jesus Christ. So there were many mystery play cycles in different parts of England, in Lancashire, and around London, in Northumbria, in all parts of England. In fact, they were performed in the churchyards, especially during carnivals. And of course, too, there were pantomimes, the performances which were called pantomimes, often performed by clowns. Okay, so you have both comedy and tragedy. Serious plays where the mystery plays, along with the morality plays, which are actually allegories. Okay, morality plays, which represent things like virtues, vices, as persons, personification of qualities, personification of virtues and vices. So these are rudimentary plays. Okay, in fact, the precursors of Elizabethan plays. So Elizabethan plays actually grew out of these performances. So one must not forget the early continuation of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. So the Norman conquest actually did not end the Anglo-Saxon chronicles immediately. They continued at least for another 100 years or so. So, and by the 13th century, they had ceased to be written. So, mention need to be made of an important personality who was not a writer, who was not a literary personality himself, but who was instrumental in making many of the texts written during the medieval period known to people in the later centuries. He was Caxton, William Caxton, the first English printer who started printing books in England from 1476 onwards. So he printed Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. He printed Malory's Maud the Other. He printed a number of texts. He printed Lydgate's prose narratives. And probably his first work was called History of Troy. That I think was in 1476. And he went on to print more than 100 texts during his lifetime. So printing was what stabilized English spelling to a large extent. Okay, so it's different from having isolated fragments, parchments in different parts of the country written in various spellings. So since the books had to be printed and circulated in fairly large numbers, there had to be a certain uniformity of spelling, and Caxton was able to achieve this more or less. So Caxton was also inadvertently responsible for some of the gross spelling monstrosities that we have in English, because most of the workers in his press were illiterate. They simply chose the fonts which they were told to, and while arranging them, often made gross mistakes. So the monstrous, or what some people call the monstrous spellings in contemporary in monstrous spelling of contemporary English can also be attributed to Chaucer's, Caxton's workers, the compositors who worked in Caxton's press. Okay, so by the 15th century, we enter the modern English period. So by then, the foundations of contemporary English literature were laid. And the sonnet, the Petrarchan sonnet, which was popular in Italy in the 14th century, it had been probably experimented. We don't have specimens, but quite likely it was tried out by people like Chaucer during the 14th century. But the first known sonnets are by Wyatt and Surrey in the 16th century. Okay, who, of course, what we today call the English sonnet arrived in the 16th century. But certainly one can say that it was certainly a borrowed form, borrowed from in which English ethics, English style, the new Norman style, the new Anglo-Norman style was superimposed. So here we have a brief description of Middle English by